Welcome everybody. Dr. Heather Sebo. She's a classical scholar specialising in ancient Greek drama and mythology. And some of you know her as the marvellous leader on our program Homer's Greek Islands, which takes you on a journey through the Homeric landscapes of Crete, the Peloponnese and the western areas of the mainland and the islands of the Ionian Sea. Heather is leading a new program to the northern reaches of Greece, to Macedonia and Thrace, exploring the world of Philip II of Macedon and his overachieving son Alexander the Great. It's of philosophers and theatres and sanctuaries and oracles, all overlaid later by the Romans, the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And this is where Heather will be whisking us away this evening as she presents her lecture, Sailing to Samothrace and the Sanctuary of the Great Gods.
Well, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about the remarkable sanctuary of the great gods at Samothrace. But first of all, I'd like to talk about the overall journey, our overall journey in northern Greece. So we start in Thessaloniki, Greece's second major city after Athens, and this first leg takes us to the stunning waterfalls of Edessa, to the Neolithic settlement of Despilio on Lake Castoria. We visit the ancient Macedonian sites of Pella, Miedza, the royal tombs at Arge, and then Zeus's sanctuary at Dion in the foothills of Mount Olympus. Next, we follow the expansion of Macedonia eastwards to the great Hellenistic cities of Olynthus, Stagiaira and Philippi. We visit Kavala and Drama. We see the remarkable Aegitus River caves, travel by ferry to the island of Thasos, and then from Amphipolis to Xanthi in Thrace. The last part of our tour takes us deep into northern Thrace, to some unique Roman sites, and then further off the beaten track to the mysterious, rocky, windswept island of Samothrace, which is the subject of my talk this evening. Our journey ends in neighbouring Lemnos, the island especially loved by the Homeric craftsman god Hephaestus. Now let's retrace our steps to Samothrace and the mystery cult of the great gods. Samothrace has an archaeological history that goes back at least 5,000 years, 7,000 years actually. The Minoans had a mining operation there in the 1600s BCE. That's in the Bronze Age, mining tin and copper. And settlers from Thrace lived and worshipped on the highlands from about 1200 BCE. The Thracian worship was chthonic, offered to the elemental forces of raw nature and to the earth itself. And as we'll see, Samothrace is certainly the place for it. The Thracians also had a cave sacred to a goddess called Zerinthia. Samothrace lies just 29 nautical miles off the coast of Thrace. The Thracians had been there for 600 years when the Greek refugees arrived from Samos. The Greeks called the island Samos on Thrace, English Samothrace, or as modern Greeks say, Samothraki. All the evidence tells us that the two groups mingled peacefully and that the Thracians shared their sacred sites with the newcomers. But it seems that the Greeks felt a special affinity with the site of the great gods on the lower slopes of Mount Fengari, because from about 500 BCE, they gradually took over the running of the sanctuary. However, and I'll be emphasising this throughout the talk, it's especially interesting that the Greeks preserved the Thracian aspects of the site, they retained the Thracian ritual and the Thracian gods, and most amazingly kept the Thracian tongue as its sacred language. As you can see on the slide, Samothrace is dominated by Mount Fengari, which rises a mile into the sky from the sea and is the tallest peak in the northern Aegean. Homer tells us that the sea god Poseidon watched the battles of the Trojan War from its tallest peak. And as we'll see, Samothrace elicits its own myths. The Greeks said that Dardanus, the founder of Troy, escaped from the rising waters of the great flood on Mount Fengari at the time when the poet Lycophron wrote that the sky streamed ceaselessly like a river and the whole earth was drowned and everything was fathomless sea. Lycophron also says that the seals shared the beds of men at that time of the great flood. Samothrace is a dynamic island of rock and water. Even in summer, over 61 streams and waterfalls cascade down its slopes. During a storm, every crevice and ravine becomes a raging torrent that carries boulders and debris that gash and reshape the landscape. The ancient Greeks revered running water as a source of healing and prophecy, as a place to encounter the gods. So it's no wonder that they, like the Thracians, thought that the powers that created the world were viscerally present at Samothrace. And the island retains its ancient character. There were catastrophic floods and landslides on Samothrace in 2014 and again in 2017. And it's not unusual for inhabitants to be imprisoned in their houses under tons of snow in the cold winters. The sanctuary of the great gods is located in a rugged valley that has been carved out by the running water torrents that I've been talking about. Geologist William Size describes it as a dangerous geological site, and he wonders why the ancients would have chosen it. But we know why. It's a numinous place where earth and air and water periodically combine in a spontaneous process of destruction and renewal. You can see that the site is steep and scarped. Actually, it's far steeper and more rocky and difficult to traverse than the aerial photo shows. The sanctuary spreads across 3 basalt terraces, each separated by a deep ravine, which becomes the conduit of the kind of powerful torrents that I've been speaking about. And crossing and recrossing these precarious ravines to the sound of rushing water must have been integral to the emotional experience of the mysteries. The central ravine, and I'll mark it for you here, the central ravine is the lowest point, and as you can see, it cuts down the length of the sanctuary. And pottery deposits found there tell us that it was at the heart of the mystery rites. The eastern ravine is closest to us, you can see it on the slide, but the third ravine is behind and below the third terrace. You can't see it in the photo, but here on this slide, the 3 ravines are marked in blue, and you can see how they define and protect the sacred valley. After 300 BCE, when the sanctuary became famous throughout the Greek world and elites were pouring wealth into the most innovatory buildings of the Hellenistic era, efforts were naturally and necessarily made to control the damaging water, and the various kinds of retaining walls built by the Greeks and then later by the Romans is a study in its own right. Ancient sources say that the experience of initiation into the cult of the great gods was open to all, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or status. The only requirement was that the pilgrim be free of blood guilt. We do have testimony that initiation was a harrowing experience, so why did so many people choose to do it? Well, the great benefit, the promise of the great gods, was that initiates would have successful journeys, protection in times of need, and most especially rescue from peril at sea. And this last was a powerful promise. On this early Greek vase, made about the same time that the Greeks were arriving in Samothrace from Samos, we see men drowning after a shipwreck. On the left, you can see there just around the circle, a man is being eaten from the head down by a large fish, It's difficult to see, but it's clearer in the drawing. For a human being to be at the bottom of the food chain was a shocking idea for the Greeks, and to combine this idea with death at sea was a worse nightmare. In their worldview, someone without proper interment could not enter the underworld, but would be lost to wander for all eternity. And without a grave, a place of memorial, they would also be erased from human memory. Initiates were bound by an oath of secrecy, and nobody ever did tell. So we only have a few clues about what happened during the ceremony. However, ancient sources do say that initiates were given magnetized iron finger rings mined from the island's rich iron core. In the ancient world, magnetism was regarded as a life force, and the magnetized ring gave an initiate physical contact with the power deep in the Samothracian earth, and it was a token of the divine protection promised them. The power of the ring to draw things to itself also demonstrated the bond with the other mysties, that is, with the other initiates, and with the great gods. At the centre of the slide, you can see 2 iron rings that were uncovered on the eastern hill. The third was found in the central ravine, and it's said that some initiates had their iron rings coated in gold, which didn't interfere with the magnetism. Contemporary writers also say that initiates were given a purple sash to wind around their bodies, which recalled the episode in the Odyssey, where the shipwrecked Odysseus is saved from drowning in heavy seas by the intervention of the goddess Leucothea, the white goddess. And she says to Odysseus, "Take this veil, it is immortal, and fasten it under your chest. There is no reason for you to die nor to suffer." The revisionary Samothracian version of the Odyssey was that Leucothea intervened because Odysseus was an initiate. I don't know what Homer would have thought about that, but that's the Samothracian version. The testimony of initiates confirms that the ordeal was life-changing. Initiates experienced a shivering awe of the gods. They saw visions, felt terror, felt confusion, disorientation, and also ecstasy. And they emerged as a stranger to themselves. The philosopher Aristotle is supposed to have said, "One did not learn the mysteries, but experienced them." It seems as though he might have been an initiate. The polymath Plutarch writes, "One encounters an extraordinary light. Pure regions offer welcome with voices and dances and majesties of sacred sounds and holy sights." And the historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that initiates become more just and better in all ways than they had been before. Samothrace was formally incorporated into the Macedonian kingdom in 340 BCE, so the Greeks had had control of the sanctuary for quite a while by then, and Philip II ensured that it became a dazzling Macedonian showcase. Nevertheless, Thracian remained the sacred language, and the new Hellenistic buildings also preserved the distinctive Thracian elements, such as the escara, or sunken pits for burnt offerings to the underworld gods, the bothroi, singular of bothroi is bothros, the pits for pouring liquid offerings into the earth, and rocks revered as sacred objects in their own right. And this is very apparent in the building that archaeologists call the Hieron. Now, on the face of it, and from what you can see, the Hieron appears to be an iconically Greek building, yet it has an escara in the centre of the inner chamber. I'm pointing those out even though you can't see them very clearly. And at the southern end, and you can see this, you can see a large marble block cut right through in a semicircle for libations to be poured directly into the earth. The Hiron also had an internal secret apse, and this really is strange in a Greek building. Overall, the construction material is marble, but the apse is made from rough stone and it had a completely earthen floor. The apse was a kind of internal cave, and we remember that the Thracian goddess Zerinthia was said to have a sacred cave on Samothrace. The apse is very likely to have been the setting for special rites. Indeed, it may have been used for a higher degree of initiation known as the epoptea. The model of the sanctuary that you see on the slide is how it was in about the 5th century BCE. It's been constructed meticulously on the basis of the continuing American excavations on Samothrace. Now you can see that arrow there is pointing to the Huron and pointing to the apse end, and you can see that the apse is not apparent from the outside of the building. And while I have this image up, I'd just like to point out that the Huron is tucked away behind a building that's now called the Hall of Choral Dancers. And the only way to get to the Huron is to actually cross that central ravine and recross again. So it's tucked away and it's a secret place. This aerial photo of the existing foundations of the main buildings does give you a better idea of the apse. And you can see the Hall of Choral Dancers is barely there, but there it is with the Huron tucked behind it. This is what you see if you visit the sanctuary today. The great gods were never named in inscriptions or represented in images that have been found on site. They are simply the great gods, always the unnamed gods, and always thought of as a group. Apollonius of Rhodes calls them the local divinities to whom belong the mysteries of which I am forbidden to sing. Objects found in the sanctuary, and this is this part of simply calling them gods, objects found in the sanctuary are often simply stamped or incised with the Greek letter theta, which is the th. It begins the word theon, which means, as you can guess, of the gods or belonging to the gods. And as you can see on these objects, the theta is minimally represented by a line or a dot in a circle. So they remain, the point is here, they remain anonymous, unnamed great gods. What do we know about them? Well, the ancient writers who commented on the sanctuary, even though some of them, of course, were not initiates and there were many things they were not allowed to say because, of course, they'd taken the vow of secrecy, the ancient writers seem to have called the great gods whatever name made best sense to them. How often? They are most often called the Kaviri. Like Aristotle, the 5th century Herodotus seems to have been, 5th century historian Herodotus seems to have been an initiate. And he wrote, anyone who has been initiated into the secret rites of the Kaviri, which the Samothracians derived from the original inhabitants and now practice, knows what I mean. It's a wonderful little example of potted history, the thing I've been talking about, the Greeks taking the rites and the notion of the great gods from the original inhabitants. And they know what I mean, says the historian Herodotus. The Kaviri were divine beings that belong to the dawn of time, and they belong and they occupy a space between mortal and divine. And in most stories, they are born from the earth and they are associated with important developments in human civilization, the really early developments in human civilization, especially fire and metallurgy. They're also inventors of armour, of beekeeping, and of what the playwright Euripides called the hide-stretched primal drum. The Kaviri are most especially, as you would expect they would be, associated with mystery initiations. The Kaviri are sometimes interchangeable with other primal earthborn beings such as the daimones or the dactyles or the coryvantes or the Curetes, and some of you will have heard of the Curetes, who protected the infant Zeus by clashing their armour and drowning out his cries when he was hidden in the cave on Crete. Popular belief also identified the Caviri with the twins Castor and Polydeuces, who travelled with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece. In later times, the Dioscuri, two twins, were thought to appear as St. Elmo's fire to help sailors in distress at sea. And so here we have it again, this theme of help at sea, of rescue from peril at sea. It's essential to this sanctuary, set in quite rough seas, right up there in the northern Aegean. Fascinatingly, a 3rd century BCE scholar called Nicias gave the gods, the great gods, names with the prefix axio. And Axio is a Thracian river god, and that's the right kind of god for an island of rivers. Nicias names a goddess Axia Kersa and 2 male gods, Axia Kersos and Axieros. He also mentions a 4th male divinity called Kasmilos. We don't have these names anywhere else, but they are the names that Nicias mentions, and it is interesting that they have this Thracian prefix, which kind of convinces me that maybe that's as close as we'll ever get to the names of the great gods from Samothrace. But you'll see that nobody really knows what to call them. Perhaps the initiates did. But again, it's a fascinating fact, and I just repeat it, that just as the Greeks preserved the Thracian language at the sanctuary, they also never assimilated the great gods to recognized Greek divinities. They didn't call them Zeus or Hera or Demeter. They simply remained the great gods and they weren't named. So what is it about the mysteries that was so compelling? Was it the promise of protection and rescue at sea? Well, I think there are 2 historical factors that made the idea of a special relation to the gods extremely attractive. 2 historical factors separated by about 300 years. The first was the anxiety-producing breakdown of cultural certainties experienced by Greeks engaging with an unknown world. From at least the 600s onwards, unsustainable population growth in Greece, scarcity of land and resources led to wide-scale migration, and the foundation of settlements and trading posts right across the Mediterranean and all the way to the Black Sea. And every red rectangle on this map is a Greek settlement, extraordinary number of settlements, 600 or so BCE. The yellow rectangles are the Phoenicians. Samothrace, you can see it there, Samothrace itself was on the route to the critical Athenian grain supplies in the Black Sea. So in seeking a new livelihood, farmers, ordinary farmers and merchants were confronted with entirely different mentalities and cultures to their own Greek norms. In the north, they came in contact with polygamous Thracians, with cannabis-smoking nomads, with tattooed Scythian women and mounted female warriors. These are all very different to the cultural norms of Greece. In the Homeric Odyssey, Odysseus's meetings with strange beings and monsters is a literary expression of this encounter with the alien other. The old certainties were shaken, and already in the early 500s, a little bit after the time that the Greeks were settling on Samothrace, the philosopher Xenophanes was questioning everything, including the very existence of the gods. In an extraordinary development of human thought, he was saying things like, Ethiopians make their gods black and snub-nosed. Thracians make their gods red-haired and with blue eyes. And if cattle or lions had hands, they would paint their gods and give them bodies like their own, and horses like horses, and cattle like cattle. this really is an extraordinary departure from any certainties about the divinity or about divinities, that there were far, far greater upheavals to come. 200 years later, Philip II shocked the Greek world with his ruthless expansion of the Macedonian kingdom, and at 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he became master of Greece. And at a stroke, the old world view, or the old world order of domination by Athens, Sparta, and Thebes disappeared forever. And that was just the beginning. The conquests of Philip's son, Alexander III, known as the Great, redrew the known world even more dramatically. I've added some modern names just to emphasize the extent of what turned out to be a vast but very short-lived empire. After Alexander's unexpected death at 33 years of age, his generals murdered his relatives, and they turned on each other, and they unleashed a new and terrible kind of destruction as they fought to seize parts of this vast territory for themselves. My focus on the trauma of the age might possibly be compared to the geopolitical shifts in our times, but I'm going to take a new slide to give you an example of kind of disorientation I'm speaking about, the kind of trauma I'm speaking about, and it's an example that I find deeply shocking. In 291 BCE, the Athenians, I'm talking about the Athenians, who refused to bow to the might of Persia 200 years earlier than this period, than 291 BCE. They had refused to bow to the might of Persia. They had abandoned their city. They had fought against overwhelming odds. I'm talking about these Athenians who now greeted their new debauched Macedonian overlord, Demetrius Poliorcetes. Poliorcetes means the besieger, with these wince-making words: "The other gods are far away, or cannot hear, or are non-existent, or care nothing for us. But you are here and visible to us, not carved in wood or stone, but real. So to you we pray. First make peace, dearest, for you have the power." Let that sink in. Now, we've seen that the Greeks did not import their own gods or their own language into the mysteries. But Greeks were, and they always have been, and they still are, inveterate storytellers. Now, I've already told you the stories of Dardanus and Odysseus and how they were adapted to associate them with Samothrace. But even more than these two, the stories of the adventures of Jason and Cadmus especially lent themselves to an episode at the sanctuary. These two, Jason and Cadmus, are both heroes of travel to new lands, and of first contact with foreign peoples. Indeed, unlike the Homeric Odysseus, who is actually blown off course, these two set out willingly into the unknown. Now, I'm sure many of you know about Jason and the 50 or so Argonauts and their quest across the Black Sea in search of the Golden Fleece. The Argonauts were the greatest heroes of their time, and in some traditions, their sea voyage is the first sea journey in the history of the world. Many of the Argonauts are fathers of the warriors who fought at Troy, and they also include Heracles, the poet Orpheus, the healer Asclepius, and of course the Dioscuri I mentioned earlier. Apollonius says that all of the Argonauts were initiated at Samothrace in order to survive the voyage across the Black Sea, and of course they did survive. And Diodorus Siculus says that they made gifts to the sanctuary in gratitude for their survival on their way home. Now, Cadmus is a different kind of hero. He was a Phoenician prince, not a Greek. He has a Greek lineage, but a Phoenician prince sent out to find his sister Europa, she'd gone missing, and actually she had been abducted and seduced by the god Zeus. absolutely unknown to anyone. But that is another story, a very, very fascinating story, but a story for another time. Some of you will know that Cadmus consulted Apollo's oracle at Delphi about Europa's whereabouts and was instructed to stop searching for her and instead to found the city of Thebes. Well, the Samothracian version is that before he ever went to Delphi, Cadmus came to Samothrace. In some versions, he even has his mother with him, and he stumbled into a ceremony already in progress in the sanctuary. Cadmus becomes an initiate. He's the first foreigner to be initiated, and he catches a glimpse of Zeus's daughter Harmonia in the torchlight. And some of you might know Harmonia as the daughter of Ares, but that's the Southern Greek version. In the Samothracian version, Cadmus and Harmonia are married, and a sublime banquet is hosted by the gods, who give them divine music and new kinds of musical instruments as wedding presents. And Diodorus mentions cymbals and tambourines among the divine instruments. They are the kinds of instruments that you would associate with the kaviri. And this was said to be the first human marriage ever attended by the gods. In the minds of some Greek initiates, Cadmus and Harmonia might perhaps have become associated with their initiation experience. I mean, this is a Greek story, and it would be very easy for an initiate to start to associate this story with their experience. And we know that the initiates also celebrated a mystic banquet with the gods at the end of their initiation. But I want to stress that there is no evidence that Cadmus and Harmonia, that story, the Cadmus and Harmonia story, was ever formally assimilated into the Samothracian ritual. I'm showing you the American excavation simulation of the Hall of Choral Dancers. You saw it on the plan before. The building gets its name from the 100-metre-long frieze that once encircled its exterior walls, depicting 900 musicians and dancers. About 10 metres of the frieze have survived, and some scholars have thought that it represents the wedding of Cadmus and Harmonia. Now, what I want to point out, and the reason I wanted to show you this, is that all the musicians and the dancers on this frieze, I've only shown you a very small piece, but there are a lot of fragments that have survived. As I say, there's about 10 metres in all. And I just want to point out that they are all young women. And no fragment has ever turned up that has a male figure on it. They are all young women. And for this reason, it's unlikely to be a wedding dance. And it makes better sense to interpret this frieze as a dance in honour of a great goddess whose name may well have been Zorinthia, or Axia Kersa, or the Mountain Mother. Now, with the help of the American excavations and their insights, let's reconstruct what we can of the movements of initiations through the sanctuary. We do know that the rites were conducted at night and by torchlight, because stands for torches have survived, as well as many, many small clay lamps all over the site. So from the earliest times, the pilgrims approached the sanctuary down a rocky hill, across the frightening gorge of the eastern ravine, and then they followed a plunging path to a deep hollow on the other side. So across the ravine and then down a steep path to a deep hollow. But after the 200s BCE, the ravine was bridged by a dramatic propylon or gatehouse, and you can see the American excavation simulation on the right-hand side of the slide. So a gatehouse now over the ravine. Notice that very, very narrow door. The American excavation has absolutely insisted that it was a very, very narrow door. So each initiate, each potential initiate, would have had to enter individually, separately. So they enter now through this dramatic gatehouse. They descend via a ramp down to the steep hollow, but the steep hollow is now paved and surrounded by tiers, 5 tiers of steps. And this is what survives. This is what you would see if you visited Samothrace. We will see. Archaeologists now call this the theatral circle. It's the earliest preserved ritual gathering space in the sanctuary. It's where the pilgrims stood for preliminaries, and it must have included a proclamation requiring that they be free from blood guilt. And this is where the initial purification rites would have taken place, very likely using water from the eastern ravine. This is what it looks like today, and you can see what an extraordinarily difficult and steep and rocky site it is. But now I'm showing you a simulation again from the American excavation. We know that at least 22 over life-size bronze statues stood on the outer tiers of the theatral circle, but there is nothing to say who they represented. My guess is that they would have been heroes like the heroes I've been speaking about, like Cadmus and the Argonauts and Dardanus and Odysseus and Heracles and Orpheus. That's not to say that these figures would have been assimilated into the actual initiation ceremony, but perhaps the Greek stories penetrated this far, but then perhaps not. Perhaps the figures represented something else, but we do know that there were 22 over life-size bronze figures, and that they certainly would have been impressive. And I couldn't resist adding the bronzes to give you some idea of the effect. So they're my bronzes that I've put into the American simulation. I think that these larger-than-life figures would have felt like formidable guardians of the sanctuary, as well as unique witnesses and mentors to the initiations. After these preliminaries, the pilgrims passed around the side of a building that was dedicated on behalf of the joint Macedonian Kings Philip III and Alexander IV. Around that building, you can kind of see how you could get around the side and down a steep sacred way into the heart of the sanctuary. And I've numbered the pictures so you can get some idea of the sequence. The American excavation has demonstrated that the buildings were placed so as to restrict movement and visibility, and especially by lamplight, everything would be suggested and nothing quite revealed. And as they walked, the initiates would have become aware of that huge rotunda. I'm talking about that rotunda on the right-hand side of the top image, and they would have been obliged by the increasingly narrow pathway to walk in single file. And you'll see that picture 4, the 4th picture in the sequence, actually is looking back up the sacred way, just to give you some idea of where they've come. So they have the rotunda on one side, and as it turns out, they have the Hall of Choral Dancers on the other. But I do specially wonder what happened inside the rotunda of Arsinoe II. It was a huge, sophisticated structure, partly built over an ancient rock altar to the Great Mother. But it was also a man-made cave without windows and only one narrow door, again these very narrow doors. And the Thracian Bothros and Esgara were preserved inside. And after the rotunda, the pilgrims would approach the Hall of Choral Dancers with its wonderful frieze, and it too had 2 interior Bothroi. And here are the remains of the sacred way and the rotunda of Arsinoe II, as you will see them today. As we know, initiates experienced overwhelming emotions during the long night of ordeals. But with the dawn, they finally passed from terror to celebration, freedom, and bliss. You'll recognise this model now. It's the American excavation model. The celebratory banquets took place in the buildings over the central ravine. We've been so far looking at the buildings that are on the eastern side of the ravine, but now the celebratory banquets took place on the western hill. The west was the place for the more worldly activities. The eastern side was the sacred side, the side of new life, the side of new light. And in the light of a brand new day. The Misties could visit the 100-metre-long stoa. You can see the stoa there. They could wander through other fine buildings and examine their treasures. And there were many reasons to linger. For example, one wealthy donor had an entire ship dragged up into the sanctuary and a building constructed round it. And that's the Nerean, the ship monument that you can see on the slide. And that donor was probably the son of the same Demetrius Poliorcetes that I spoke about earlier, who was hailed as a saviour by the Athenians. As I say, the building is the Nerean, or the ship shed. Now, the famous winged victory of Samothrace originally stood at the apex of the western hill above the theatre. And she's caught in the moment of descent from the sky, alighting on a ship's prow. The ship upon which she touches down is angled straight along the central ravine and right out to sea. If you could just see further, you would see the sea in the distance. In the Louvre, the Nike is a celebrated work of Western art. In the sanctuary, she is an embodiment of the promise of divine protection. Of course, Greece wants her back. The cult of the mysteries continued into Roman times. St. Paul the Apostle visited it in 50 AD, but finally the Roman Emperor Theodosius closed the sanctuary in about 398 AD. 200 years later, about 600 AD, 1,000 years or so after the Greeks first arrived from Samos, the powerful natural forces they so revered ripped the sanctuary apart and buried it under a devastating landslide, left there for archaeologists to find. Now, I'm just showing you on the slide now some select online lectures that some of you might be interested to pursue, and following that, the URLs, the references to some of the images on the slides that you might be interested to access.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Were there any questions?
Okay, just a quick question, Heather. Blood guilt, what do you mean by that? Presumably somebody's killed someone, but what else had they got to do to absolve themselves of their guilt?
Yes, they will have had to go through some kind of ritual that would absolve them of blood guilt. And if they haven't gone through that, if they have shed blood and haven't been purified in some ritual manner, yes, they are not eligible. And now, of course, nobody's checking up on them, but I don't think anyone would feel that they would want to offend the great gods.
Okay, thank you.
Are the mysteries in any, are there lots of Greek mysteries, and are they related? I was wondering about the Eleusinian mysteries near Athens and whether this is some sort of Greek tradition that you find everywhere.
Yes, there are the mysteries of Eleusis. The audio has been good enough to bring us out. I've been at pains to emphasize that this is different because these are not Greek gods. They're not using the Greek language. They're not using Greek modes of worship or ritual. So yes, the Greeks do mystery religions, and initiation is part of Greek culture, but this is very different to the mysteries at Eleusis.
Well, if no one's got any other questions, I'll send a big thank you to Heather for delivering a fascinating lecture and an introduction to a part of the world that I suspect most of us, even with a love of archaeology, have never really delved into the world of the Thracian gods and their mystery cults. So thank you very much. I think you've triggered a spark of curiosity there, Heather.
I hope I really have, because it is fascinating.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much, Heather. It was interesting.
Indeed. Thank you
Bye-bye.
both. It's been terrific.